Hi, everyone. It's time to buckle up tight for a mind-bending story that's equal parts unsettling and unexplainable. I'll try to keep this factual, but some of the events of this recent backpacking trip through Klamath National Forest in Northern California defy easy explanation. So, put on your stirrups and be sure to listen up closely, because here are the incredible details, straight from the horse's mouth. There were four of us: me, Matt, my girlfriend Susan, definitely more comfortable with city sidewalks than forest trails; Mike, my college buddy, always game for an adventure; and Jessica, Mike's girlfriend, a bona fide nature enthusiast. We planned a 3-day trek through a remote section of the forest known for breathtaking views and, according to some online accounts, a few encounters with, well, let's just say, unidentified creatures. We weren't exactly believers, but the mystery added a subtle thrill to the trip. The first 2 days unfolded like a classic backpacking adventure: towering pine trees, crisp mountain air, and the usual forest animals to watch: deer grazing, chatty squirrels, and a particularly gutsy raccoon who took off with half a bag of Mike's chips, much to his amusement. We set up camp for the second night near a backcountry ranger station that we all agreed had a strange aura. The windows were boarded shut, the paint peeling in patches, and the whole place emanated a sense of trespassers unwelcome. We brushed aside the unsettling feeling that the abandoned building gave and settled in for the night in our tents. Around midnight, a sound ripped us from our sleep, a howl that made no sense. It wasn't a wolf howl, nor a coyote's cry. It was something entirely different that made us all sit up on high alert until the sound finally faded away. Sleep, after that, was completely impossible. The next morning, we packed up camp as planned, with intentions of continuing our hike, but a nervous tension was hanging in the air. Susan was tasked with taking down the trail cam that we had set up the night before. We always do that to document our trip and have something to look back on that's totally an organic and natural capture of our evenings. Anyway, as she was packing up, she quickly scanned the images and spotted something peculiar. The cam had been positioned so that it was pointed towards the ranger station, and most of the pictures were unremarkable: nocturnal scavengers feasting on some discarded trash, a blurry image of a curious deer. But then came the last image. Grainy and dark, captured with the camera's flash, it showed an undeniable presence on the porch of the abandoned station. A massive, dark figure stood there, easily surpassing 7 feet in height. Its broad shoulders were draped in what looked like coarse fur, and the flash caught 2 glowing red orbs staring directly back at the lens. We stared at the picture. The silence that surrounded us was thick enough to cut with a knife. Each of us grappled with the impossible image, our minds searching for a rational explanation that simply wasn't there. We were basically trying to keep ourselves from becoming terrified as what had been right next to us while we slept. I couldn't help but think that the online whispers we'd scoffed at suddenly felt a lot more real. Panic gnawed at the edges of our composure. We packed up camp with a frantic haste bordering on undignified sprinting, wondering if that thing might show up again in the daylight. Luckily, we didn't encounter anything else out of the ordinary on our descent, but the encounter left our heads reeling. Back at the trailhead, a sense of relief washed over us. Civilization, with all its normalcy, felt like a warm embrace. We piled into the car, the silence persisting even as we turned onto the asphalt road. It wasn't until we were miles away, the image of the glowing red eyes a distant memory in the rearview mirror, that Mike finally spoke. "So," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "what do we do about what just happened?" But the truth is, they didn't have an answer. They'd seen something that defied explanation, something that challenged everything they thought they knew. And now, they're reaching out to all of you, hoping that someone out there might have had a similar experience, or might be able to shed some light on this baffling mystery. So what do you think? Could there be a logical explanation for the creature they saw? Or did Matt, Susan, Mike, and Jessica stumble upon something truly otherworldly in the depths of Klamath National Forest? One thing's for sure, this is a camping trip they'll never forget. Something wild happened to me a very long time ago in the mid-60s. I'm now in my late 70s, so that will give you an idea of how much this has stayed with me. And to be honest, I've told this story only a handful of times since it happened, and every time I've been mocked. But I know that you'll all believe me, so I thought I'd write in just to help get myself out from under these memories. I was 19 years old at the time, and just heading out into the world on my own. I'd been living with my parents, and they'd always been the kind of strict parental figures that required me to play it safe. Then, once I was out of their house, I started to take life a bit more loosely, just to test the waters a bit. I decided that summer to head to Chicago on my own. I'm from a small town in rural Ohio and had never been on a big solo adventure, so even though it's really just a few hours' drive away, I thought it would be a good way to dip my toes into big city life and make for a fun adventure to tell my friends about when I got back. The only problem was that, at that time in my life, I was more naive than I knew, and I craved the company of other people. That's when I noticed a guy hitchhiking with his thumb pointed the same way I was going. Remember, this was in the very early days of the turnpike, and hitchhiking hadn't become illegal yet. Yes, I know it was a risky and dangerous thing to do, but I pulled over and told the guy I could take him as far as Chicago. He was happy for the offer and jumped right in. I did tell him I had one condition for him riding with me, though. He had to empty his pockets and put everything he had in the trunk. I'd heard awful stories about hitchhikers being serial killers, and I wasn't going to risk him having a gun or a knife to stick to my throat once we were down the road away. He agreed to my terms, and we walked around to the trunk, which I opened for him. He then gave me a side look and turned his back to me to somewhat block the items he was putting in the trunk. He loaded them up into a backpack and zipped it up, then shoved it far up into a corner of the trunk before hopping in for the ride. The way he acted freaked me out a bit, but at least everything was in the trunk. And so, we got to talking. At first, he actually seemed really cool and down to earth. He told me about his upbringing in Northern California, growing up with a twin sister, and how he'd once worked in law enforcement. He was very vague about his role in law enforcement, though, but I chalked it up to him maybe having to leave the job for reasons he wasn't proud of. He certainly didn't owe me any explanation. I then started telling him a bit about my life, too. In an amazing coincidence, he and I both had twin sisters, so that broke the ice a bit. After sharing what we had in common, I guess he felt a little more comfortable opening up to me, which might sound like a good thing. But this is where this whole situation took a turn for the weird. The guy told me that he was former CIA and that he had wound up learning of a massive government conspiracy and cover-up regarding the Roswell, New Mexico discoveries. It revolved around the fact that we had essentially poisoned these visitors from outer space, declaring war on another planet, and that we are all just sitting ducks, now waiting for them to deal a blowback. He went on to tell me about how he was going to uncover this information years ago and blow the top off the whole thing. But that's when the CIA sent someone to kill him and dispose of the evidence. But he'd managed to outsmart them, and that's why he was out in the world homeless, hitchhiking from city to city to keep from being found out. At this point, I was regretting my decision to invite him along, because I was thinking he was a total lunatic and maybe even a dangerous person to be around. I decided to change the subject to something a little less intense and hopefully get him to calm down a bit. My plan was now to work out an excuse to drop him early at the next town. So, to change the subject, I asked him, simply, what his star sign was, and told him I'm a Leo. He whipped his head around and looked at me like I'd just grown an extra head, and started demanding I let him out of the car right away. I kept asking him to calm down, but every time I'd try to calm him, he'd panic and yell back at me, "You're one of them. You're one of them." Finally, I was able to pull off at a rest stop, and he opened the door, jumped out, and ran straight back into a field. I was so flustered by the whole thing that I sped off without even thinking about the fact that I had all his stuff still back in my trunk. That thought didn't occur to me until I was already in Chicago. I felt terrible and didn't know what to do about any of it. I certainly didn't want to see that guy again. But my mother had always told me that if you find something that isn't yours, you should turn it in. I figured the police were the best bet in this situation. They could play the middleman. So I stopped at the first police precinct I could find and took the stuff inside. I told them I'd given a hitchhiker a ride, but that he seemed a little crazy. I told them how he took off, and I forgot all about his stuff in my car until then. They had a good laugh and asked me if I'd learned my lesson about offering strangers rides. One officer even kind of half scolded me for taking such a dumb risk. I assured them that I would never pick up another one, and I've been true to my word on that ever since. But that isn't where this insane story ends. A few weeks later, I was sitting at home back in Ohio, playing video games in my apartment when there was a loud knock at the door. When I answered, I was surprised to find two men in black suits asking to come inside and speak to me. They had a lot of questions about the hitchhiker and what all he might have said to me before he took off running. I remembered what he said about the CIA trying to kill him for knowing too much, and these guys certainly seemed to be agents of some kind. So I bluffed my way through it, pretending he had been so crazy I didn't understand a word of anything he said. Bottom line is that I didn't give anything away as to what I had heard. They didn't seem convinced, but what could they do? Well, I'll tell you what they can do. It's been almost 60 years now, and I swear I still occasionally see black vehicles parked on the street outside my house with dark tinted windows, and no other explanation for them being there. I used to see them more frequently, but not so much as of late. And I've even moved numerous times and raised a family while this all was happening. I never did tell my wife about the black vehicles. She knows the original story, but I never wanted to scare her and tell her that the story basically never ended. To be honest, it's amazing how persistent they are. I mean, that guy must have really been someone important that they want to keep tabs on, especially to have been keeping tabs on me too. I often wonder if it's only a matter of time before I've got my thumb in the air trying to stay one step ahead of them, too. Last year, a buddy and I decided to go camping in the Coconino National Forest area in Arizona. We were both needing to escape the stress that had built up and to just immerse ourselves in nature for a while. Our plan was to stay for several days and take things easy. When we got there, we set up our camp near the lake so we could try out my new canoe. The first couple days went great. We were hiking and fishing and canoeing, and we were finally starting to decompress. On the third day, we were relaxing at the campsite after hiking in the morning. Suddenly, we both caught a whiff of something foul-smelling, like a garbage can on a hot day. Of course, we both started joking and accusing each other of being the guilty culprit. We laughed it off and figured it was just a passing smell. But about an hour later, I was fishing by the shoreline of the lake when I caught the same foul smell again. It was a lot stronger this time, and I couldn't ignore it. I looked around, trying to figure out where the smell was coming from, but I didn't see anything. It was unnaturally strong, though, and it was bothering me to not be able to identify it. I walked back to the campsite, and the smell stayed strong. We looked everywhere around the campsite, but we still came up empty-handed. As the day went on, the smell kept coming and going. Then when we were cooking dinner later, we started hearing something that sounded like someone chopping wood a couple 100 yards up the hill behind us. It went on for about 10 minutes, with intervals in between, and we couldn't help but feel a little unnerved by it. We wondered who would be chopping wood at this time of night when it was so dark. The thing is that the chopping was coming from a wooded area where there were no campsites. We kind of wanted to investigate, but we decided it probably wasn't the best idea to wander into the forest at night. The chopping sound eventually stopped completely, and then there was this really deep silence that seemed to hang in the air. We tried to shake it off and focus on cooking dinner, but we couldn't help feeling a little spooked by it. We eventually relaxed and were drinking and talking when suddenly we heard a deep, throaty bellow. The sound was so loud that it echoed through the hills above us and made us both stop talking immediately. I knew for a fact that there was no wildlife in Arizona that could make that kind of noise. We decided to move our tent and other camping gear right up to the shore of the lake. We figured that whatever was out there would have a harder time sneaking up on us from that direction at least. But we were feeling pretty nervous by then. We thought about packing up and heading for the truck, which was on the other side of the lake by the road we had driven in on. But it had taken us half an hour to walk into our campsite on the first day, and we didn't want to risk running into whatever had made that sound. We decided to stay put and keep a close eye out. We made sure to keep the fire going, thinking that might deter whatever it was. Probably about an hour after we'd heard the bellow, we heard the chopping wood sound again, but this time it was further away than the first time we heard it. It just didn't make sense. Then, about 10 minutes later, we heard footsteps coming toward us along the shoreline. We shone our flashlights in that direction, and we saw a guy and a girl heading toward us carrying a bunch of gear. When they got closer, we could see that they looked scared, and we asked if they had heard that strange bellowing sound. They said that they had and were too worried to stick around. We discussed our options and decided that it might be best if we banded together and hiked back to the forest road where our vehicles were parked. We packed up our gear and headed out, trying to look in every direction while we walked. The whole time we were walking to the road, that foul smell was in the air again. It was seriously overwhelming. As we were approaching the road, we heard a loud snap of a branch, and the girl started running ahead of us. Then about halfway between us and the girl, this giant thing stepped out of the trees. It was like a 7-foot-tall ape covered with dark, shaggy hair. It was huge and really buff with these huge shoulders and chest and no neck. It was probably only about 50 feet away from us. The girl had kept running and we couldn't even see her anymore. The three of us just stood there like morons gaping at this thing. Then it let out a bellowing scream. It was like a jolt of adrenaline had shot through us and we all just started sprinting up the road as fast as we could. We were gasping for breath, but we didn't stop until we reached our vehicles and drove the hell out of there. That thing was terrifying. You wouldn't believe how huge it was. No way in hell would I ever try to camp in that area again. I always wish we had a way to contact that couple so we could talk about what happened, because I'm sure it was a Bigfoot. But it seems if you mention Bigfoot to the uninitiated, they pretty much put you in the crazy box right away. Anyway, I'll be interested to hear if any of your listeners have had any weird experiences in that area. Hi there. I'm a new viewer and I found your YouTube channel when I was scouring the internet looking for answers. I wasn't much of a believer in all those paranormal things people talk about. I've always just thought folks were overreacting, letting their imagination run wild. It feels weird to be on the other side now, to have a story to tell that a lot of people will think is fake. But I can swear right now, this actually happened. I have a small farm in Townsend, Delaware. Just some chickens and corn to sell, but not a lot. And we keep a cow for our own use. Plus, we have a medium-sized garden to feed our family. That's in Newcastle County, about a half hour from Battery Park. There are a lot of farms out here in this area. We've been having some trouble with something getting to our chickens these past 6 months or so. I figured it was a fox, managing to get in under the fence. A couple of times lately, I'd go out in the morning and find a mess of feathers, but no offal or feet or anything. Whatever got to the bird, it carried it off to eat. I've got a German Shepherd, but he's still mostly a pup, and I don't quite trust him yet to wander around loose. He stays in the house at night. But the night that this happened, we'd penned him up on the enclosed porch because he'd gotten into something that made him sick. Nothing serious, but I didn't want him messing up the house. So when he started carrying on around 2 in the morning, barking and whining, I wasn't sure if he just had to go do his business or if he saw something on the property. Either way, I had to get up and take him outside. I did grab my rifle, though, thinking I might catch the fox in the act. The first sign I had that something was wrong was the way my pup was acting. He got out on the grass and sniffed the air and then whimpered and didn't want to roam. Now, usually he just races around like a goof and I've got to keep whistling for him. But he just stayed near the side of the house and did his thing, then scampered back over to the porch. I let him back in, knowing he'd had a time of it, and just figured he still felt ill. While I was out, it made sense to walk out to the hen house and see if everything looked right. It's a little bit away from the house. As I was headed over there, the cow started bellowing, which is really unusual for her. I decided to stop at the barn first. When I checked on her, she was all right, but really twitchy, all wide-eyed and nervous. I looked around good to see if I could see a snake around. You know, that will spook a cow. I didn't see anything, so I let her be and went on to the chicken pen. Once I'd gotten 10 yards away, I could hear the hens fussing. Something had them all riled up, for sure. I threw the bolt on my rifle so I'd be ready to nail the fox if I saw him. I've got lights up over the pen, and the area was pretty well illuminated. There are 2 structures for the birds and a small shed where I keep the feed. I looked through the fence and didn't see anything, but something had them squawking, so I unlatched the gate and went inside. As soon as I got in there, I could smell it. There was a strong scent of sulfur, like you'd just lit a match. I remember panicking for a second, looking for fire. I guess I just associate sulfur with fire. I wasn't even thinking about the fox now, just sniffing the air and trying to figure out what's burning. Then I hear a squawk from a bird, and it's just cut short. It came from behind the feed shed. I stood still for a minute, knowing something had just killed a hen. I crept over there real easy with my rifle aimed, coming around the corner. When I saw the thing, I almost dropped my gun. That's how shocked I was. It was crouched down low, huddled over the hen it had caught. It was as big as a large calf, with a goat's head and curved horns, and there were damn wings on its back, like something out of a storybook. I just froze, forgetting about the gun in my hand. The thing looked up, and I swear, it just looked evil. Glowing yellow eyes, and its head all bony and ridged. It was holding that dead hen in these little front legs like you see on a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Skinny, with talons. The thing screeched at me, and the sound was like something straight from hell, like a cross between an angry giant bird and the scream a cougar makes. I stumbled back and fell on my ass, dropping my gun. Then I scrambled up as quick as I could, scared to pieces it was going to attack me. I snatched up my rifle and pulled the trigger, shooting like a crazy man, not even taking time to aim. The thing took off. It actually flew. These giant bat wings just unfolded and it launched into the air, carrying the hen. I saw its legs then hawked like a horse's, and it had a skinny, whip-like tail. The thing didn't rise too high. Maybe it couldn't. It only went about 15 feet up and flew straight away, not higher. I shot at it one more time, but I know I missed. I really didn't have much of a chance. Well, I guess I did, but I blew my chance by falling on my ass. I went out the next morning to look for something to prove what I saw. There were signs of a scuffle behind the shed and some tracks in the dirt that looked like hooves. But it's been dry lately and they didn't imprint well. I took pictures, but you can't really tell what you're looking at. In fact, they looked like nothing, and I just deleted the photos. I've decided I'm going to get one of those hunter's cameras with night vision that's motion activated. I'll set it up in the chicken pen, and maybe I'll get lucky and get a picture. If I do, I'm going to send it to you. Then I'll have proof there's something weird out here in Delaware farm country. Keep your fingers crossed for me. In 1998, I was working as a police officer for the town of Chillicothe in Ohio when the scariest day of my life happened. I was working the midnight shift, and it was around 2:30 a.m. when dispatch called me and told me to go to a residence about 2 miles away. The person who lived there had called 911 and said something was outside of his house growling and trying to get in. I arrived at the location within 5 minutes and parked my car about 50 yards from the house. I grabbed my flashlight, checked my firearm, and got out of the car. When I got out of my car, I could hear this deep growling coming from behind the house. It sounded like something really big. The owner of the residence was standing on the front porch with a terrified look on his face and was pointing in the direction of the noise. I nodded to them that I had heard it too, and then proceeded to walk around to the back of the house with my flashlight off so as not to alert whatever it was that I was approaching. As I reached the corner of the house, I saw that there were 2 chain-link fences that ran parallel to each other about 10 feet apart, going away from me for about 40 yards before they ended at a tree line. It was like some sort of dog run or something, but I couldn't exactly make out what it was. I then just stood there for a few seconds trying to figure out what was making the noise. Then I heard a rock being thrown as it hit the fence about 10 feet in front of me. I shined my light in the direction of where the rock hit and saw something that still haunts me to this day. Standing there looking at me was one of the scariest things I have ever seen. This creature stood about 6 foot 7 inches tall, had long, dark brown hair all over its body, and had a face that looked like it belonged on a wolf or bear. It had yellow eyes and long, sharp teeth that were bared as it growled at me. The creature stared at me for about 15 seconds before it turned around and began to walk away from me, slowly following along the fence line and dragging its hand on the fence as it walked away. I immediately drew my weapon and started firing warning shots into the ground near it, trying to be sure it continued moving away. It did continue, but flinched when my shotgun went off only 20 feet from it. I watched this thing for almost 5 minutes as it walked along into the distance. I was so scared that I could not leave, and it took everything in me to not run away. I just stood there poised and ready to retaliate if need be. After what seemed like an eternity, the creature reached the far end of the fence line and just stopped there, then turned around and looked at me. It stood there for another few minutes before it began to walk back towards me, still dragging its hand along the fence. To this day, I have no idea why it decided to come back towards me. As this thing got to within 15 feet of me, I could now smell a foul odor coming off of it that was worse than anything I have ever smelled before or since. Then the creature walked up to within 10 feet of me and stomped on the ground a few times before turning around again and walking away. Again, walking slowly until a loud screeching noise pierced the air. And whatever made that noise must have been something the creature understood, because it suddenly seemed spooked. And it turned around and bolted full speed towards the tree line, where it disappeared from sight in about 2 seconds flat. My heart was pounding out of my chest as I stood there trying to comprehend what I had just seen. I was so shaken up that I went back to my car and sat in the driver's seat for about 15 minutes trying to collect myself. Thank God the homeowner was no longer on the porch, because I don't think I could have kept my composure well enough to talk with them to follow up about what had happened. I finally relaxed and got the confidence to drive away safely. It wasn't until a few years later, when I watched a documentary on Ohio Bigfoot sightings, that I had the shocking revelation that that seemed to be the exact same creature that had basically stalked me behind this house. Ever since then, I have been convinced that these creatures are real. To this day, whenever someone asks me if I believe in cryptids, my answer is always yes, because you don't know what you don't know. And those are words to live by.